Amelia Dyer is possibly Britain's most prolific serial killer. She killed for money, her victims being babies born to unmarried mothers who couldn't care for them. She managed to evade the police for decades, using aliases and moving from house to house, despite young mothers and the police trying to find out what had happened to their babies. The body of a baby that she'd murdered and had thrown into the river was found and traced back to her address. Up until this point, she'd narrowly managed to escape arrest on several occasions, even pretending to be insane and ending up in a mental hospital. Amelia Elizabeth Hobley had been born at Pyle Marsh near Bristol in 1839, the youngest of 5 children, to shoemaker Thomas Hobley and his wife Sarah. She went to a fee-paying church school to be educated and had a comfortable childhood until her mother caught typhus. She would hallucinate, and Dyer was expected to help look after her. This allowed her to later feign insanity. In 1861, she married George Thomas, a man more than 30 years her senior, and following the marriage went on to train as a nurse at Bristol Royal Infirmary. In 1864, when she was 26, she fell pregnant with their first child. She was forced to leave nursing when she began to show, as was custom, but soon found another way to make money. Ellen Dane was a midwife and became Dyer's lodger. She made extra money by offering to help pregnant women who wanted to keep their pregnancies quiet, and offered an additional service of adopting out the unwanted babies. Dyer saw this was a fairly easy way to make cash, so it was something she knew she could do, thanks to her nursing skills. When her husband, George, died in 1869, she was left a single mother to Ellen, and knew she would struggle financially, so turned to baby farming. Her first step, however, was to farm out her own daughter. Dyer's adverts began appearing in the local papers. She allowed women to stay at her home as they began to show, until they gave birth. Then they would leave with their baby, or leave the child behind for Dyer to look after for a weekly fee, or put the baby up for adoption for a larger fee. But it wasn't her intention to do that. Often she would smother the baby at birth, so it would look like a stillbirth. Underfeeding a child to kill them was too noisy, so they were given laudanum or brandy to quieten them down. Laudanum dulled the need for food, so some of them starved to death. She herself self-medicated, taking laudanum to possibly make what she was doing more acceptable. In 1872, she married William Dyer, and went on to have 2 children by him, Mary Ann, known as Polly, and William Samuel. Dyer lost her job, so she returned to baby farming. In 1879, 4 of the children she was caring for died within the space of 2 weeks, and this led to both the doctor who certified them and the police to become suspicious. Inquests were ordered into the deaths. Dyer, meanwhile, decided to take a massive laudanum overdose, taking 2 bottles of it. It was enough to kill anyone who did this, but it never killed her, as she was so used to taking it. She was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison with hard labour. She was 46. On her release, Dyer returned to baby farming. Now she was murdering them rather than starving them to death. Her routine became that she would go to the town where she was to collect the baby from, get paid, take the baby from its mother, return home, then take out some dressmaker's tape, tie it round the baby's neck, and pull. The baby would stop breathing. Then she'd place the body in brown paper and tie it up with string before throwing the package into the River Thames, weighed down with bricks. Over time, it seems she became desensitised to what she was doing. As time went on, she focused her attention on wealthier clients, therefore making more money. But in 1890, a young governess would be the undoing of Dyer. The young woman had fallen in love with the master of the house and fell pregnant. She saw an advert in the newspaper from Dyer and eventually moved in with her during her confinement. She was persuaded to leave her baby when it was born, but when she returned a few months later to make the final payment, Dyer handed her a baby, but she knew it wasn't hers. Dyer tried to fob her off, but she stripped the child looking for a birthmark. It wasn't there. She repeatedly tried to gain access to her child, even bringing the police with her, but Dyer managed to put them off by making false statements, saying the baby had been adopted, giving numerous addresses, knowing all along she'd murdered the governess's baby. But now she was under pressure, and with the governess not giving up, Dyer had a mental breakdown and was sent to an asylum. But the timing is interesting. The net was closing in, and the breakdowns were short-lived. So was this a calculated move by Dyer? In the early 1890s, she left the Somerset and Bath lunatic asylum and was sent to the local workhouse where she made friends with widow Jane Smith. She told her she wanted to rescue babies and enticed Smith with promises she knew she wouldn't keep, asking her to call her mother, and she would call her Granny Smith in front of prospective clients. Smith became a servant, cleaning the house and looking after the children, not what she'd hoped for. Babies perpetually came and went, and Smith became suspicious. She didn't know where all these babies were going. At Reading, Smith went to a converted shop which housed the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Centre, where she saw photographs of children. Mrs. Bennet came out and asked what was wrong, and she told her that she was a nurse for Amelia Dyer, who took these children in, and said they disappeared as quickly as they arrived. Dyer was visited by Charles Bennet asking if she had the correct paperwork and licences, but she said no. He reported her to the police and his head office and was told to keep her under observation. A few weeks later, Smith noticed a smell emanating from a kitchen cupboard. A lodger also began to complain about the smell, so Dyer got up early one morning and scrubbed it. Then she was seen leaving the house with a brown paper parcel under her arm, claiming she was taking some old clothes to a charity shop. On Tuesday, 30th March 1896, a Thames bargeman saw a package in the river and pulled it out. Inside was the body of a baby girl with dressmaker's tape around her neck. There was also an address in the package, although it said Mrs. Thomas of Pickett Road. By 3rd April, the police were knocking at Dyer's door. She tried to say it wasn't her and had nothing to do with her, but the police were having none of it. They found cupboards full of clothes, letters from mothers, and a jar with tickets for babies' clothes that had been pawned. The evidence was damning, and she was arrested at her home, 45 Kensington Road in Reading. Dyer was charged the following day with murder at Reading Police Station. The charge sheet read that she did feloniously, wilfully, and of her own malice afterthought, kill and murder a certain female infant, Helena Fry, daughter of one Mary Fry. In the cells at the police station, she attempted to take her own life with a shoelace, but her attempt failed. Further evidence came when police dredged the river and a carpet bag weighed down with bricks was found on Friday 10th April 1896 with the body of 4-month-old Doris Marmon. Her mother, Evelina Marmon, a 25-year-old unmarried barmaid, had wanted temporary care for her daughter with Mrs. Harding, as Dyer had called herself, but Dyer had persuaded her to pay £10 and give up the child for adoption. Along with Doris's body was that of 13-month Harry Simmons. This was a key piece of evidence, as a carpet bag was identified by a boy who lived at Dyer's. Her daughter and son-in-law were also arrested as accessories to murder. Mary Ann Palmer and her husband Alfred Ernest Palmer were later released after Dyer confessed to the murders. Did they know what was going on? That remains an unanswered question. Dyer tried to plead insanity to stop herself from being executed, but the jury at her 2-day trial before Mr. Justice Hawkins at the Old Bailey in London said she was sane and found her guilty on Friday 22nd May in less than 5 minutes of deliberation. On Wednesday 10th June 1896, she was hanged at Newgate Jail by James Billington. Over her 30-year career, it's possible she killed up to 400 babies. Amelia Dyer would go down in history as the Angel Maker, the most prolific serial killer in the UK. On Tuesday, 4th March 1879, a young Irishwoman returned to Rose Gardens in Hammersmith for the first time in 6 years. She had friends in the London street, Harry Porter and his wife Anne, who she decided to visit and catch up with. With her was a young boy, her son. She would go on to become infamous. Kate Lawler, better known by her married name of Webster, had been born around 1849 at Killaan in County Wexford in Ireland. She had married when in her teens and had 4 children, all of whom had died in infancy. Her husband, who she claimed had been a sea captain called Webster, also died. This left her to fend for herself, so she turned to crime, including fraud and theft, and spent stints in jail in both Ireland and England, where she moved to in 1867. She was also known to lie about herself and her life, so no one really knew the real Kate. On this March afternoon, her friends were astonished at the change in her. Before she had been shabbily dressed, but at the door stood a self-assured and well-dressed woman in a silk dress. At her side was her son, and she was carrying a black canvas bag. Anne and Kate sat down, and Kate poured whisky from her pocket and told Anne her story. She'd remarried and was now Mrs. Thompson, but her husband had recently passed away. The boy with her, she explained, was her son, John Webster, better known as Johnny, who'd been born on 18th April 1874 at Kingston upon Thames. She also went on to say that an aunt had also died, and in her will, she had bequeathed Kate her house, one of a pair of cottages known as Vine Cottages, also known as Mayfield Cottages, in Park Road, Richmond. The property was a semi-detached two-storey villa and sat near the public house, the Hole in the Wall. Later that evening, Harry and his son Robert accompanied Kate to the local railway station, stopping at various pubs on the way. Robert carried her bag, which he noted was quite heavy. During one drink, she excused herself, as she told them she had to drop off the bag to a friend in Barnes. She headed off over the Hammersmith Bridge, and 20 minutes later returned, without the bag. Robert went on to accompany her to No. 2 Vine Cottages, and when they arrived, Kate produced a heavy wooden box and asked if he would carry it for her, as it was for a friend she was meeting at Richmond Bridge. He did. She then took it from him, telling him to wait for her, and headed off over the bridge. A short time later, he heard a splash in the water. The following morning, a coal porter, Henry Wheatley, discovered a wooden box stuck in the mud near Barnes Bridge. Curious, he gave it a good kick, and it split open, displaying its contents. It contained human remains, wrapped in brown paper. At a post-mortem examination, it was concluded the body parts in the box had been boiled, but the head and foot were missing. The foot was later discovered on 10th March in a dung heap at allotments in Twickenham. What had made Kate's bag so heavy was presumed to be the head. The remains were buried at Barnes Cemetery on 19th March. In the meantime, Kate was getting all the furniture removed from 2 Vine Cottages. As it transpired, the house belonged to the next-door neighbour, Elizabeth Ives, and she became suspicious when on 18th March, delivery men were removing the furniture. She knew Kate was her neighbour and daughter, Julia Thomas's maid. But where was Julia? She confronted Kate after the man told her that Mrs. Thomas had sold it to John Church and pointed to Kate as Mrs. Thomas. She became agitated and fled, picking up her son from the porter's home where she'd left him and returned to Ireland, staying at her uncle's farm at Killan, but the police were already after her. At the cottage, they discovered bloodstains, charred bones, and fatty matter, so an arrest warrant was issued for Kate. She was apprehended quickly and charged with the murder of Julia Martha Thomas. Julia Thomas was a former teacher and was a widow for the second time by the time Kate came to work for her. She was a well-dressed lady, but according to neighbours, she had an excitable temperament and was regarded as being eccentric. Although not by any means wealthy, she wanted to give the impression of being so, and having a maid employed would give her an air of respectability that the middle classes so enjoyed. However, her maid turnover was high, and on 29th January 1879, Kate became the latest in a long line she'd employed. This was at a time when Kate had just been released once more from prison. Her son had been looked after by her friend Sarah Crease, who worked for a Miss Loader, who knew Mrs. Thomas was looking for a maid at the time. It seems Kate didn't get on too well with her employer. Mrs. Thomas, who was around 54 years old, was set in her ways and liked things to be done in a certain manner, and this infuriated Kate. Kate later said, "At first I thought her a nice old lady, but I found her very trying, and she used to do many things to annoy me during my work. When I had finished my work in my rooms, she used to go over it again after me and point out places where she said I did not clean, showing evidence of a nasty spirit towards me." In the end, Mrs. Thomas, who by this time felt uncomfortable with Kate around, gave Kate her notice to leave on 28th February. However, Kate managed to persuade her to keep her on for another 3 days. When the woman returned from church on 2nd March, Kate snapped. What actually happened between them is unknown, but Kate claimed they'd argued at the top of some stairs and had pushed her down them. To stop her screaming, she'd then strangled her. Once she was dead, she dismembered her body, disposing of it in various locations. On 2nd July 1879, her 6-day trial began at the Old Bailey in London. Sir Hardinge Giffard, the Solicitor General, headed up the prosecution case, while Kate was defended by Warner Slay, a prominent London barrister. She pleaded not guilty, claiming it was a man called Strong, the alleged father of her son Johnny, but she was found guilty, thanks mainly to the testimony of bonnet maker Maria Durden. Kate had visited her the week before the murder, claiming she was going to sell furniture, jewellery and property left to her by an aunt. The murder, it seems, was premeditated. The judge, Justice George Denman, sentenced Kate to death by hanging, but trying to put it off for as long as she could, she feigned pregnancy, but the courts were having none of it. She was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on 29th July 1879, William Marwood carrying out his duty as executioner. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. On 22nd October 2010, while workmen were excavating the ground bought by Sir David Attenborough in Park Road, where the former hole-in-the-wall pub once stood, they discovered a skull. This was near to Mrs. Thomas's former home, and not far from the pub Kate and the porters had visited while on their pub crawl. It was sent for forensic analysis to the University of Edinburgh, and at an inquest on Tuesday 5th July 2011, it was confirmed by the West London coroner, Alison Thompson, to be the missing head of Julia Thomas. The verdict of unlawful killing was recorded. However, the discovery of the head poses a number of questions, the main one being, how did it get there? Who had Kate given the bag to that contained it? Was it this man Strong? Had he returned to the cottage to bury it? It's unlikely we'll ever know how it ended up there. When a death occurs, much sympathy is felt and there is generally very little suspicion that anything is amiss. When another family member dies, followed by another death, then it's definitely worth investigating. This, it transpired, was the case of a family in Victorian Liverpool. Sisters Catherine Flanagan, born in 1829, and Margaret Higgins, born in 1843, hailed from Ireland and had moved to Liverpool in 1864. The two sisters lived at 5 Skirving Street, where Catherine ran a lodging house, while Margaret was a charwoman. Living with them was 22-year-old John Flanagan, Catherine's son, Thomas Higgins, who became her second husband, her first husband Joseph having died previously, and his 10-year-old daughter Mary, from his previous marriage. Also living there was Thomas Patrick Jennings and his 18-year-old daughter, Margaret. In December 1880, the formerly healthy John Flanagan died. His mother had informed neighbours that he was ill, telling them, "He is in consumption. He will never live to comb a grey hair." As it turned out, he possibly had TB, which was common at the time. But was he a victim of his mother's and aunt's greed? After his death, his mother collected £71 from 5 different insurance companies, which at the time amounted to around 2 years' wages. At this point, no suspicions were raised. In 1882, following the blossoming of romance between Margaret Flanagan and Higgins, the two were married in October of that year. Just a few months later, young Mary died, and the £22 in insurance was collected. Then in January 1883, Margaret Jennings died, and Catherine collected the insurance money on her, amounting to £20. In those days, you could insure someone without their knowledge or their consent. As a result of these deaths, the sisters knew it was time to move on, ending up at their new home at 27 Ascot Street. By this time, Thomas Higgins was well insured, and in September 1883 he began to become unwell. The policies amounted to £100, but Catherine approached the insurers on behalf of Margaret to see about taking out a further insurance policy on him, amounting to £50. The insurers thought this was rather strange, so decided they would need a medical examination of Higgins before issuing the cover. A doctor and representative of the insurance cover appeared on the doorstep of the Ascot Street house to see him, but were stoutly and strongly told to leave. At this point, Higgins knew nothing about the insurance policy on his life, and when he died on 22nd October 1883, the doctor who issued the death certificate cited the cause of death as dysentery due to excessive drinking of cheap alcohol. The insurance companies were quickly made aware of the death, and the two of them, the British Workman Insurance Company and the Scottish Legal Life Assurance Company, paid out £12 9 shillings and sixpence and £7 17 shillings and sixpence, respectively. However, Patrick Higgins, Thomas's brother, had got wind of the attempt at putting extra insurance on the policy, remembered all the deaths at Skirving Street, and this didn't sit right with him. He raised his concerns with the insurance companies about the possibility of foul play. He then went to Shaw Street and spoke to Dr. Whitford, who'd attended to Higgins during his illness, and he agreed to go and look at the house where his patient had died. When he arrived, Catherine beat a hasty retreat and fled. The doctor carried out a post-mortem at Higgins' house during the wake, and following a series of tests, concluded that Higgins had died of arsenic poisoning. Soon after this, Margaret Higgins was arrested for the murder of her husband, and evidence of arsenic powder was found by Dr. Campbell Brown in an apron pocket worn by her, and a bottle containing a white powder in liquid also turned out to be arsenic. A wanted poster was distributed for the capture of her sister. Not only did they describe her, but they also enforced on the minds of the public her strong Irish accent. Catherine was finally captured just over a week later at Wavertree. The two sisters were charged with the murder of 36-year-old Higgins on 16th October 1883, and committed for trial for the murder. They were also implicated in the murder of Margaret Jennings on 25th January 1883 and John Flanagan Jr. on 7th December 1880, while Margaret was also charged with the murder of her stepdaughter Mary. However, the Crown prosecutor decided to go with the first indictment only, that of the murder of Higgins. On Thursday, 14th February 1884 at St George's Hall in Liverpool, their trial got underway before Mr Justice Butt. The two women were defended by William Pickford, Queen's Counsel, and Henry Gordon Shee, Queen's Counsel, with the funding to pay for them coming from the Poor Persons Defence Fund. The Crown prosecution case was led by John Aspinall. The bodies of the three other victims were exhumed, and traces of arsenic was found in all of them, but the prosecution case rested mainly on circumstantial evidence. There was no concrete evidence the two women had administered the poison, and their defence claimed the arsenic in the exhumed bodies could have got there by the leaking through the soil in the graveyard. In his summing up, the judge was scathing of the insurance companies. He also reminded the jury that Campbell Brown had also discovered arsenic in Higgins' spleen, which he believed meant the dead man had been poisoned over a period of time before he succumbed. Did they believe arsenic poisoning had been the cause of death? Did they believe the women had administered it? Following the jury's half-hour of deliberations, the sisters were found guilty of murder, and the judge passed the death sentence on them. Catherine later confessed that they got the arsenic from a particular flypaper that contained enough to kill, and claimed many more had been murdered in this way for insurance fraud by others she knew. Whether what she said was true or not, it was never believed. The pair were held at Kirkdale Prison, known as the Kirkdale House of Correction, in Liverpool, where 55-year-old Catherine and 41-year-old Margaret were hanged simultaneously on Monday, 3rd March 1884, as the snow fell. The executioner was Bartholomew Binns, assisted by Samuel Heath. The women's bodies were cut down and they were buried within the prison grounds. In 1893, the prison closed and was demolished. It is now a recreation ground. Binns carried out his last execution at Kirkdale a week later, after which he was sacked for being drunk and incompetent at carrying out hangings, following the botched hanging of 18-year-old Michael McLean. Questions remain about how many people actually died at the hands of Catherine and Margaret. Had Catherine's first husband Joseph also fallen foul of the women? Were these the only victims, or were there many more? We may never know the true number of lives taken by the Black Widows of Liverpool. Mary Eleanor Wheeler was born on 26 March 1866 in Kent to James Wheeler and his wife Charlotte Ann. When she was a toddler, she was dropped and hit her head, complaining for weeks that it hurt, and often complained of headaches. She went on to suffer from epilepsy, although whether the fall was a contributory factor is unknown. She was joined by her sister Amelia in 1868, although she died in 1871, and another sister, Charlotte, was born in 1871. 3 brothers followed: James, Charles, and John. By this time the family had moved to Stepney in London. When Mary was a teenager, she began working for her uncle, John Kelly, in his newsagents. She then went to work for a German family, the Prumers, as a nurse to the newborn son, George. But her fits grew worse, so they dismissed her in the summer of 1882. A month later, her father died, and a few months after that, she tried to take her own life, one of several attempts. She would tell people that she'd been married to a well-off young man in Piccadilly, but the place she claimed that this had happened simply didn't exist, and there was no record of any marriage. She met John Charles Pearcey, a carpenter, and the two lived together, although they were never married, but she used his surname. Soon, Pearcey discovered she not only told elaborate stories about her life, but that she'd been unfaithful to him, so he ended the relationship. She then met furniture remover Frank Samuel Hogg when she was 19, but it was a complicated relationship, as he had a wife, Phoebe Styles, and a baby daughter, also called Phoebe, but known as Tiggy. Phoebe had fallen pregnant to Hogg, and in those days it was expected that marriage would follow. He, in turn, also believed Mary was married to Pearcey. Nonetheless, Mary and Frank began their intimate affair shortly after his marriage to Phoebe in November 1888. By 1890, Mary was living at 2 Priory Street in London, between Camden Road and Kentish Town Road. Frank lived nearby in Prince of Wales Road. According to newspaper reports, Mary had led an immoral life in that she'd been a sex worker, but with Frank, something changed in her. She wrote him love letters, but it seems she never asked him to leave his wife or to stop sleeping with her. She even met Phoebe and looked after her during a bout of illness in February 1890, but Mary never visited her again after this. By October that year, Phoebe had become suspicious that Frank and Mary were having an affair. The marriage was in difficulties, with the pair having temporarily separated, but they got back together. It was also around this time Mary was suffering from persistent headaches that lasted for days, possibly brought on by stress. Frank decided to end the relationship with Mary on 22nd October. On Thursday, 23rd October, Mary sent a message boy with a note to Phoebe and invited her to tea the following afternoon. Surprisingly, Phoebe accepted, and along with little Tiggy, walked to Priory Street, happily pushing the baby in her pram. She was led into the back kitchen and suddenly attacked. It was brutal. She had her skull smashed in with a poker, then had her throat cut, all carried out by Mary. Neighbours later confirmed that at around 4 p.m, they'd heard screams coming from the house. Mary somehow managed to drag the body and place it in the perambulator on top of the baby. She then left the house, pushing it towards a railway arch at the end of the street and out into the dark streets of the city. A few hours later, Phoebe's body was discovered abandoned on a pile of rubbish in Crossfield Road, with little attempt to hide the remains. Police were called, with Inspector Wright and Dr. Wells arriving at the scene. Dr. Wells believed the victim hadn't been dead long. The black pram was found about a mile away, with its cushions covered in blood. 18-month-old Tiggy was found 2 days later behind a hedge on Finchley Road by Oliver Smith. Her cause of death was suspected to be either from being smothered or from exposure. On Sunday, 2nd November, Phoebe and her daughter were buried together at Finchley Cemetery. Mary was swiftly arrested on suspicion of murder, as she'd been seen pushing the pram that night by witnesses. Police searched the house and found blood spatter on the walls, ceiling, and matted hair and blood on the poker, as well as on a carving knife. When asked by police what had gone on, Mary told them she had a problem with mice and was trying to kill them. At the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey, in London, on Monday, 1st December 1890, Mary stood before Justice George Denman, charged with murdering Phoebe Hogg and her daughter, Phoebe Hanslope Hogg. James Forrest Fulton and Mr. G.F. Gill led the prosecution case. Mary, who was transported to the court from Holloway Prison, was defended by Arthur Hutton and pleaded not guilty. Hogg himself was at one stage thought to have been involved in the murder of his wife and child, but he was exonerated from any wrongdoing in the affair. He had accounted for his whereabouts that Friday, and when he arrived home and his wife and child weren't there, he simply thought they'd gone to Chorley Wood, where Phoebe's father lay ill. As the evidence was presented, it transpired Mary claimed that as they were having tea, Phoebe Hogg had said something she didn't like. The dead woman had been hit on the back of the head with the poker, then hit again, another twice. Then the head was severed by several cuts. Hogg revealed he had a latchkey to the Priory Street property and could let himself in whenever he liked, but the relationship ended 2 days before the murder took place. Dr. Bond told the court the kitchen floor of the property had been recently cleaned and scratches were found on the back of Mary's hands. Another doctor, Dr. Pepper, told the court of the injuries sustained to Phoebe. Mary was clearly suffering from some kind of mental disorder, but doctors concluded she was sane enough to stand trial. She maintained her innocence throughout. On 3rd December 1890, 24-year-old Mary was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. During her incarceration, only her mother, her sister, and her solicitor, Frederick Frake Palmer, visited her. Her execution took place at 8 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday 23rd December at Newgate Prison. James Berry, the executioner, later said she was the most composed person of all those involved in her execution that day. When asked to make her last statement, she stated, "My sentence is a just one, but a good deal of the evidence against me was false." She was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. On Monday, 25th October 1852, Eliza Boucher was brought before magistrates, charged with infanticide, shocking the town of Barnstaple in Devon. At the time, Eliza worked for William Wadham Hill, a hairdresser and perfumier in the High Street of Barnstaple, as a servant. She had given birth to an illegitimate child and later confessed to burning the baby's body in the washhouse furnace to hide the fact she'd been pregnant. It was suspected by Kate Hill, William's wife, that she was indeed pregnant, but no matter how much she pressed her on the issue, Eliza denied it. However, discoveries were made, and there was no doubt in the minds of the Hills that she had been with child, so he questioned her again. She then admitted she'd been confined and stated she'd thrown the child in the river. She subsequently stated she hadn't thrown the baby in the river, but had buried it in the ash pit, and to give her story credence, had begun digging out the body. Except there was no body in the ash pit. She finally conceded that she'd placed the infant in the washhouse furnace, where she'd kindled a large fire early on the morning of wash day. Following her confession, she was handed over to the police authorities, but was too ill to be questioned, however, was remanded at the Union House. She was later sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment for concealing the birth. In 1854, Eliza found herself working for 43-year-old John Barnard and his wife Susan at their home Myrtle Cottage at Fremington near Barnstable. She'd been working for them since 6th April that year. On the morning of 18th October, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. At around 7 o'clock, 40-year-old John Parkin, an outdoor hand for the Barnards, came to the house and tried to get in his usual way through the back door of the yard. He found it locked, so waited half an hour when he looked in through the window. This time he saw Eliza open the back kitchen door. At this point, he expected her to open the yard door, but after 10 minutes, he decided to go round the front, go into the garden, and went round and knocked on the back kitchen window. Eliza opened the door, and Parkin entered, but as soon as he did so, he noticed she looked very ill, holding her hands at her lower back. He asked what the matter was, and she explained she'd been ill for a few hours and had been sick, bringing up some blood. Parkin went into the kitchen, and Eliza followed him. She sat down and asked Parkin to light the fire for her, which he did. Then he noticed blood on the floor. He said to her, "Eliza, what a mess you've made. Shall I call mistress?" But she told him it would pass presently. Parkin then proceeded to the back kitchen as he had something to do, when he heard a cry in the scullery, leading from the back kitchen. When he opened the door into the scullery, he spotted a black bundle in a tub near the door and saw something move in it. He asked Eliza, "What is crying?" "You have a child." "I have not," she replied. "Where does the cry come from?" she asked. He ushered her into the scullery, and she sat down near to the tub, placing her hand on the bundle in the tub. At that point, Parkin laid his hand on her arm and told her, "You shall not kill it. I will call master." She pleaded with him not to say anything, but he immediately went upstairs and called his master and mistress, who both returned with him to the scullery. When they arrived, Eliza was sitting on the stool with the bundle on her lap. It was taken from her and opened up, and inside was a baby girl who was still alive. Eliza then put her hand into the tub again, and Parkin asked if she had another child. She said yes, and pulled out her naked baby boy from the tub. "Is it still alive?" asked Parkin. "Yes," replied Eliza, "but I don't think it will live long." Eliza was then helped up to bed by Mrs. Jane Wallacott, a local dressmaker, and Parkin was sent to Barnstable to fetch the doctor, Charles Morgan. The little girl was placed in a warm bath, but it was noted blood was coming from the child's nostrils and mouth, while her eyes were bulging. She also had a 2-inch bruise at the lower part of her throat, just above her breastbone, which was pointed out by Mary Parkin, John Parkin's wife, who had washed the baby. Morgan treated Eliza, then tended to the baby, but the little girl died around midday. As for the little boy, it was too late. On his throat, in exactly the same place as his twin, was the same 2-inch bruise. Superintendent Matthew Morgan had the children removed from the house and taken to the coroner. Postmortems were carried out on the 2 children, and Dr. Morgan and Dr. Michael Cook, another surgeon, who both carried them out, came to the same conclusion, that each child had died from the violence of which the external marks were found on their throats. The babies had gone full term, and following their births that morning, were strangled. A police officer, Constable William Rattenbury, went to the house on 19th October, where he stayed until the 23rd. Eliza was arrested once more and charged with infanticide. She appeared at Exeter Crown Court before the Justice Sir Richard Budden Crowder on 18th March 1855. Mr. H.T. Cole and Mr. Beer acted on behalf of the prosecution, while Mr. Cox and Mr. Sparks acted on behalf of Eliza. At court, Mr. Cox tried to persuade the jury that there was no evidence to suggest that Eliza had intended to kill the children, but that it had been accidental during their births. Mr. Justice Crowder, summing up, telling the jury that the case required their anxious and earnest consideration, read out parts of witness testimonies. He said that if they found violence had been used in the children's deaths, then they should find her guilty, but if they had any reasonable doubt as to whether she intentionally committed violence or not, they should give her the benefit of the doubt and acquit her. Following very brief deliberations, Eliza Boucher was found not guilty of infanticide. There were rumours that John Barnard had fathered the twins, and the source of the allegation was Morgan, who'd attended Eliza. This infuriated Barnard, and he went on to attack Morgan with a horsewhip, severely injuring the doctor. He was charged with assault and was fined £25, or he would face imprisonment. He paid up immediately. Eliza Boucher died in 1878, aged 53.